Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those of us who are joining from around the world. I'm Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy here at the Brookings Institution, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a conversation with Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa on Palestinian politics. We're grateful for the opportunity to engage with the Prime Minister at this critical juncture for Palestinians, Israelis, and the broader Middle East. Recent events, including the fragile ceasefire in Gaza, developments on the West Bank, and the expanding international recognition of Palestinian statehood raise important questions for Palestinian politics. I'll briefly introduce our speakers today. Dr. Mohammad Mustafa has served as the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Palestinian Authority since March 2024. Dr. Mustafa is an independent member of the Palestine Liberation Organization's Executive Committee and has also served as chairman of the Palestine Investment Fund, Deputy Prime Minister, and in other senior roles. We are very pleased to welcome him to the virtual stage today. Joining him on screen as moderator is Vivian Salama, a staff writer at The Atlantic with extensive experience covering Washington and the Middle East. She's reported on U.S. foreign policy for more than 2 decades, including leading the Associated Press Baghdad Bureau and reporting across the region during the post-2011 Arab uprisings. Following her conversation with Prime Minister Mustafa, Vivian will lead a discussion with Jeffrey Feltman and Hady Amr, 2 of my Brookings colleagues with deep expertise on the Middle East. Jeffrey Feltman is the John Whitehead Visiting Fellow in International Diplomacy at Brookings. His distinguished career includes serving as the State Department's Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, as Undersecretary General for Political Affairs at the United Nations, and as Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs and U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon. Hady Amr is a non-resident senior fellow in Brookings Foreign Policy. He has served as the U.S. Special Representative for Palestinian Affairs and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State during the Biden administration. He was previously a member of Secretary of State John Kerry's team working on Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and as Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Middle East at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Please note that our event today is streaming live and on the record. Please send your questions via email to events@brookings.edu. And to continue the conversation after the event, please use the hashtag Palestinian Politics. Vivian, over to you.
Thanks so much, Suzanne, and thank you to Brookings for having me. It's my honor to chat with Prime Minister Mohammad Mustafa, who's joining us from Ramallah. Just checking, do we have the Prime Minister yet?
Yes. Hi, Vivian.
Prime Minister, if you could turn on your camera, that would be wonderful. Excellent. Great to see you. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Before we get into sort of the weeds of the issues, I just wanted to really have you talk about the situation on the ground right now in the West Bank. Israel conducted airstrikes in the West Bank village of Jenin in what is believed to be one of the first airstrikes on the territory in months. Obviously, the Israeli government, which is partly led by some settler activists, has increasingly thought to entrench itself in the West Bank since the war in Gaza began. And some allies of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are urging him to annex part of the territory. And so can you please take us behind the scenes of what's happening on the ground? I should note, by the way, that the Trump administration has made clear it opposes annexation, but where do we stand right now?
Well, thank you very much again, Vivian, and thanks to Brookings for hosting us. Things are quite challenging, to say the least, about the situation in Gaza as well as in the West Bank. Although ceasefire has taken effect in Gaza, but there are still some bombing from time to time. I think yesterday more than 100 people were killed or so. And of course, we are looking forward to have the ceasefire observed by everyone and the rest of the plan that President Trump announced fully implemented. But things are equally challenging in the West Bank, as you said. And since October 7, but also before that, way before that, the West Bank has been subject to all sorts of Israeli aggressions, settlement activities, annexation, gradual, but sure enough, it's continuing. Huge restrictions of movement and access. Currently, the number of checkpoints within the West Bank is estimated about 1,000 checkpoints. Movement of movement of people extremely difficult, but also there's going on ceasefire, financial siege, I should say, imposed by the Israeli government. Currently, more than $3 billion have been withheld by the Israeli government, making our economic life extremely difficult, financial and fiscal situation extremely challenging. 15 billion shekels have been not allowed to be returned to Israeli banks and central bank, creating a huge problem for our banks. So I can tell you that at all levels, economic, financial, movement and access, settlement, annexation, in addition to what's happening in Gaza, all of this is making our people's life extremely difficult. We're doing our best, as you can imagine, to keep the place as stable as possible, but it's quite challenging. I did not mention one other factor, which is the Israeli actions against our refugee camps in the West Bank. Some of the cities like Tulkarem, Jenin have been overtaken by Israeli military forces for the last 8 months or so. They're still operating in refugee camps in Tulkarem and Jenin. Tens of thousands of families have been displaced within the West Bank. So things are quite challenging, I must say.
Since we mentioned the settler activities in the West Bank, obviously since the war in Gaza began, we saw the Biden administration particularly impose some sanctions on certain settlers. Some criticized it as too little, that it were mostly symbolic. Did any of Washington's efforts to curb the expansion of settler activities have any impact at all?
Well, I must say it's been very limited, to be honest with you. So I don't think it has really produced the kind of outcome that we're all hoping for. And therefore, I think administration, but also other European countries that have taken similar steps, should consider a bit more serious actions to give the right signal, to convey the right message to this Israeli government that this is not acceptable. This is not good for Palestinians, it's not good for Israelis, it's not good for stability in the region, and I'm sure it's not good for the rest of the world. So I think it's for the benefit of everyone. I think we need to put additional pressure on them, especially the Israeli government. As I said, one member of this government has been ignoring everyone and withholding $3 billion of our own money, basically preventing my government to perform its basic responsibilities towards our people. Including our government employees who have not been able to receive full salaries for the last few years, but also our private sector partners, suppliers. The banks have suffered quite a bit from Israeli actions. So this is all very dangerous. This is not good for anyone, as I said. And I think the action is needed, but it's without further delay.
I will touch upon some of this again, but I want to obviously talk about Gaza for a minute. The Palestinian Authority has said it plans to play a major role in post-war Gaza. What does that role look like exactly? Especially now we have a ceasefire, albeit an extremely fragile one. What do you see the Palestinian Authority doing in reality?
Okay, well, let's just remind ourselves of the fact that the Palestinian Authority was actually established in Gaza in 1994. When the Oslo Agreement was signed, it was called Gaza-Jericho First. So President Arafat actually went first to Gaza and had headquarters in Gaza for quite some time. So PA has always been in Gaza. The PA institutions, including educational institutions, medical institutions, municipal facilities, water authority, energy authority, all kind of land authority, civil authorities in terms of civil registration, everything you can think about, government functions provided by the PA in Gaza, as we did also in the West Bank. So we have always been there, if you like. Now, since 2007, things have changed, as we all know. And of course, the PA lost control over governance in Gaza, especially on the security aspects of it. But we continue to have significant staff in Gaza, including at least 35,000 employees, including thousands of security personnel, and of course 6,000 teachers, about 7,000 medical doctors. So we have always been there, if you like. But obviously, given where we are today, I think it's important to look at things in the following way. One, Gaza and the West Bank has been, if you like, agreed that these are two parts of one state. And this is according to international agreements, including the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement stipulates carefully and clearly that Gaza and the West Bank are the same territory and should be governed by the Palestinian Authority. The United Nations resolutions, without exception, have also confirmed that. The New York Declaration that was just announced a month ago in New York has also confirmed that. So everybody agrees to that, including, of course, the United States, I must say. So things obviously are not going as good as we're hoping for, given the Israeli government, this current Israeli government position on this issue. So they are trying to basically avoid having the PA back in control in Gaza, simply because they don't want us to reunite and reintegrate Gaza with the West Bank, and so we can proceed with other functions, including, of course, the establishment of the State of Palestine, which has been recognized by 159 countries from around the world.
Respectfully, Your Excellency, I actually covered the election in Ramallah in 2006 when the Palestinian Authority lost some of its power to Hamas. And a lot of it was that the Palestinian people lost faith in the Palestinian Authority. And so it started to lose popularity then, and that has continued. How do you restore the faith of the Palestinian people, especially the people in Gaza who have been through so much in the last 2 years? How do you restore that faith and convince them that the Palestinian Authority, despite all of the accords and agreements you just described, you have to win the faith of the people that you govern? How do you do that?
Well, first of all, we have been able to produce some good results over the last a few years to improve this situation through significant reforms. I can tell you, at least since I have led this government, we have developed and implemented a significant reform program in consultation and working very closely with the previous US government. Hady has been part of that, I must mention, but also with the European Union and with the World Bank. We have developed a matrix of reform, which we have been implementing in a very serious way. And we have been submitting detailed reports to the EU and the World Bank on these reforms. And I can tell you that the good progress has been made. We are not there yet fully, if you like, and we have work to do towards our people. Hopefully also that the announcements made by the president in terms of elections next year will also hopefully bring things back on track. But we also have responsibility towards our people in Gaza, irrespective, even if we are not the best performing administration in the world. We still have responsibility towards our people, especially our people in Gaza. Our people in Gaza need most, what they need most today is assistance so that we can shelter them, provide even temporary shelter. We can send their kids back to schools. We can treat the injured people. We can start to get them new, hopefully jobs, so we can start working again and be productive. And of course, we need to rebuild Gaza. Most of Gaza has been destroyed, and we need to rebuild Gaza with, of course, assistance from international partners. So there are issues to do with politics. There are issues to do with democracy. There are issues to do with international legitimacy. There is something called sovereignty. And of course, there are reforms. And of course, we have work to do, and we will be doing. And I can tell you a bit more about that in terms of what we're planning to do on the various issues on governance, and security, and on reconstruction towards our people in Gaza.
I mean,
we have plans for all of that.
The issue of reforms is obviously a big one, and one that Washington has raised as a major concern, certainly under the Trump administration, which has been very skeptical, sort of in line with the Israeli government's view that the Palestinian Authority is not carrying out the proper reforms it needs. It has cut off assistance to the Palestinian Authority as a result of that. What is the measurement what is the measure that the Palestinian Authority needs to meet to be able to convince Washington and the rest of the international community that it is, in fact, taking tangible and credible steps to reform so that you get that aid that you just so desperately just said you need, flowing back in and are able to kind of move in the right direction?
Well, nobody has specified what kind of reforms they want. Everybody is looking for different kind of reforms, unfortunately. But there, at least I can tell you the following. One is that, as I said earlier, we have developed a detailed reform program in consultation with the World Bank and with the EU and the U.S. administration, the previous U.S. administration. And I think that's, I have worked for the World Bank. I have been involved in reforms in countries, more than 45 countries around the world. I can tell you that this reform program is as ambitious and comprehensive as you can get anywhere else in the world. And we're doing it despite the fact that we're still under occupation, under siege, and we have war going on in Gaza, and we have military operations against our people north of the West Bank and refugee camps and so on. So we are committed. The reforms that are in this program are measurable. We produce reports every 3 months. The EU review them, and based on them, by the way, they also transfer funds. So some of the funds that they provide to us is performance-based, and they do pay money based on our reform performance. But the other things that I think some people are also looking for is beyond this matrix. They're probably looking for political reform. Democratic renewal is very important. That's definitely true. And we have now taken steps towards that, and including the president formed a committee to prepare a new constitution. We plan to hold the municipal elections early next year. There will be a new parties law so that people who hopefully will give up their arms will move on to more democratic, more political engagement. So we are also taking steps in terms of political reform. But I think if you ask the Israeli government what kind of reform they want, perhaps the reform they want is maybe we leave the country for them so they can rebuild their great Israel. So it's hard to know. But that's why it's important, as we are making every effort to do these reforms, we hope that this would not be made an excuse for the Israeli government to continue its occupation, whether in the West Bank or in Gaza, and prevent the implementation of the two-state solution. So reforms are needed. We are committed to that. We will get it done. We are doing it. But this should not prevent us from earning our political rights, our freedom of movement, our human rights, our rights to self-determination.
There has been extraordinary focus here in Washington about the recent efforts to get a ceasefire. President Trump calls it a peace deal between Hamas and Israel. Obviously, there were very high-profile events that took place in the last few weeks. President Trump's envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, heavily involved in the process. And we saw the Qataris, we saw the Turkish and Egyptian intelligence, and we know that Hamas was part of those negotiations. What we didn't see is the Palestinian Authority at the table. Are they speaking with you directly? Are they including you in these discussions for now what they're calling phase 2 of the reconstruction of Gaza?
Well, I think all these parties, most of them are talking to us, and we are talking to them. And the problem is the Israeli government, who is in a way putting a veto on the right party to be engaged on this. So they prefer to talk to Hamas over the PA. That is the problem. So, but we're talking obviously to Egyptians every day. We talk to the Qataris, we talk to the Saudis. I was in Riyadh the day before yesterday. And we have a meeting on the implementation of the two-state solution. 42 countries were present, including many Arab countries and many Islamic countries and many European countries. And they were in the room, and we were talking about the Gaza day after and so on. So everybody is talking to us, and we are talking to everybody except the Israeli government. So, and that's why I think it's important to remove this veto being given to Israel. Israel has no interest in having us back in Gaza. They don't want a state of Palestine to be there. That is the problem. But we hope that that our work with the U.S. government, President Trump and his team, capable team, and very have done a lot of good work so far. but also with our partners in the region, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, all of them have done a pretty good job and been very supportive. European countries have been fantastic. They have provided a lot of political support and financial support. So we have the whole world, almost the whole world, supporting us in this difficult time. But this Israeli government...
Forgive me for interrupting, but do you think it can happen if the Israeli government does not accept the Palestinian Authority role?
Well, again, I mean, why should the world accept that this government should have a veto on peace in the Middle East and peace in the world? Everybody is keen to deal with this catastrophe in Gaza. Everybody is not happy with the annexation. Nobody wants to see people displaced from their homes in the West Bank. So the international community led by the US, and I can commend the courage and determination of this US administration and President Trump in terms of, being determined, for example, in the ceasefire, and also has been consistently working with his team, sending them to the field in order to ensure the implementation of the plan that was agreed. So I think when there is a will, there is a way. When there's a political will to get things done, it will get done. When the U.S. determined that this is the right thing to do for U.S. national interest, for international peace, but also with encouragement, obviously, from regional partners, this will work. This can happen.
Regarding the international security force in Gaza that we keep on hearing about from Washington, but also other parties, what role can the Palestinian Authority play in that force that might be multinational? We're still waiting to figure out exactly what that will look like. What is your understanding of what it might look like, and what is the role the Palestinian Authority could play?
Well, what we and our partners in the New York Declaration said, and then that document, 159 countries agreed to that Gaza security should be part of Palestinian responsibility, just like governance, just like providing services, etc. So we are the legitimate agency, the legitimate entity, a government that will be responsible, should be responsible for security in Gaza. And we have been working closely with regional partners and European partners to be prepared for this. We had a plan for this. We had, as I said, a police force already in Gaza. We have part of the police force being trained in Egypt and Jordan, again with support from international community. We have the EUBAM, which is a European mission since, that was established since the days of, I think, Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, when Israel left Gaza in 2005. The EUBAM is still available, and they are going to be on the border crossing on Rafah, along with our security forces and our customs people. So everybody is working towards that end. Now, the international security force is something good if it is well designed with a clear mission in consultation with us and our partners. So we have no problem in principle with having an international security force. We believe that its presence will provide the necessary protection to our people, hopefully comfort to the Israeli side as well, because they obviously, understandably, do want to be surprised again. Hopefully, there's nothing to surprise them. But nevertheless, if that's what they want, that's fine. If it's also needed to provide additional support and training to our security force in partnership and support, that's also welcome. So in principle, we have no problem with that. We would like to see happening, though, is that if that's going to come, this would come upon our invitation, because we're the sovereign in Gaza. Two, it has to be done through a UN Security Council. Three, it has to be temporary. And fourth, as I said, in collaboration and to support also our security forces. So that's how we see it.
I think we could easily just talk about that for an hour, but in the interest of the time we have remaining, of course, I want to touch upon a few other topics. You did mention earlier that Israel has cut off funding from the Palestinian Authority for months, withholding billions of dollars. As I understand it, your government employees are missing basically a full year of wages. Given everything, the ambitious goals that you have just laid out for us, how do you even keep the government operating without funding to then be able to do all the things that you've just laid out?
Well, it's been quite a challenge, but that's really a reflection of our people's resilience and obviously given the priority to our national goals. So yes, unfortunately, this has been the case. Exactly 13 months of salaries over the last 3 years. Part of it before my government, but obviously this is continuing. So this is a huge problem. Teachers, when we started the school year in September 1st, we couldn't start on time. We had to delay the school year because teachers, some of them went on strike. They are threatening us with a strike right now, as a matter of fact, because last month we paid them only 50%. They wanted a bit more so that they can cover their expenses. We have faced a lot of difficulties. We have been able to convince first some donors to provide assistance, and as I said, some especially European countries, but also some Arab countries provided some financial assistance. Second, we have some domestic revenues limited and decreased because of the economic conditions on the ground, but so it also helps. And thirdly, we had to borrow a lot of money, unfortunately, from the banks. They reached their limit. But also, we have been also, in a way, borrowing from the private sector by buying services and not paying for it today. So we have quite a deficit with the business community. So it's been difficult. Every month is a huge challenge. Every month you have to pull a miracle to make it happen. But this has been the case for quite some time. And there is a serious threat, especially that, as I said, there is occupation is there. Settlers' activities are incredible. The movement and access and the 1,000 checkpoints. The financial situation, of course, there's also an issue of unemployment. 35% of people in the West Bank are unemployed. Many of them used to work in Israel. Since October 7th, they have been prevented. So more than 200,000 workers stopped going to Israel. That means 200,000 families lost also their source of income. So there's a real, according to the World Bank, the economy declined by about 30%. So by all standards, this is a big problem.
I mean, from an outside observer's perspective, it almost sounds like a recipe for failure.
Absolutely. I think I give credit, as I said, to our people first, who have been policemen or teachers or doctors, nurses, who still go every morning to their work and do the best they can. And they're very difficult, not only financial, but also security and conditions and movement on access. It's been extremely difficult. But again, that's another reason for the international community to support the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is important not only for the West Bank, not only to keep the place stable, but also for restoration of situation in Gaza. Believe me, nobody can be as relevant as useful to stabilize the situation in Gaza as the PA, despite all the challenges, despite all the difficulties, despite the issues that needs reform. I agree with all of that, and we are working on it, and we will work on it. But the only party that can really get things back, with support for the international partners, of course, is actually the Palestinian Authority. So I encourage everybody to help get the PA in the right place, strengthen PA capacity, not only to govern in Gaza but in West Bank, but also in Gaza, because this is the best way possible to get us out of the situation in Gaza. Situation in Gaza is extremely difficult, and no international missions alone can do it. No neighboring countries, as important as they are, can do it alone. So the PA is a big asset for stability in the region and in Palestine.
In the 2 or 3 minutes that we have left, Your Excellency, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned about the recognition of Palestine that many countries have offered, especially this year, in light of everything happening in Gaza. From a practical standpoint, how do these nations, especially some of these bigger nations, their recognition move the needle in terms of actual Palestinian statehood? Do you think it helps? Is it just more symbolic than anything? What are the realistic and practical outcomes and the reactions to this?
Well, it's definitely not symbolic. First of all, until recently, especially given what happened during the war and just before the war everybody lost hope that of the establishment of the state of Palestine, and that everybody, including those hopeful people who are pro-peace, pro-two-state, thought that it's done, no more two-state solution, look for something else, one state, whatever, apartheid, whatever. I think this will help us restore hope that the two-state solution is still possible, and there is still strong international support for it. Well, that's one. And two, it's important to remind the Israeli government and the Israeli people that, look, occupation is not the solution. There is still millions of Palestinians living next door, and they still demand their rights, regardless of time passing, despite all the challenges and difficulties and wars, etc., etc. But also on the implementation side of things, part of the New York Declaration, there has been also some good work since then, including a meeting that happened in Riyadh only 3 days ago. About 42 countries and organizations met to follow up on the implementation of the two-state solution resolution. And they have developed actually an action plan, an 18-month action plan that stipulates what actions should be taken by every party in security, in judicial, in reform, in democracy, on diplomacy, and economic relations, etc., so we can advance this course. So we have established the post goal, but then we are working together with our regional and international partners to realize that. Still work needs to be done, but at least, hopefully we still reaffirm the idea of the two-state solution. I think that's very valuable.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mustafa. Sharafna, thank you so much for joining us, and especially so late in the evening in Ramallah. Really appreciate your comments here. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you'd like to turn off your camera, and we can bring in our panel to continue our discussion. Thank you very much. Hady and Ambassador Feltman, if you'd like to join us now. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Prime Minister. So, gentlemen, you heard the Prime Minister's comments. Obviously, it was very hard to address all the issues in 30 minutes, but obviously some interesting things to unpack there. Hady, why don't I start with you? What was your biggest takeaway from the Prime Minister's comments?
Look, I mean, I think the takeaway that I have from his comments and from working with them over years is that the Palestinian leadership is in this kind of unenviable paradox by at once trying to be a national liberation movement that seeks the leadership of their people, and at the same time being judged as to the extent to which they're a security partner with Israel, which is nearly kind of an impossible challenge. And as we heard from the Prime Minister, right, Israel, by agreement, Israel controls 2/3 of Palestinian taxes. And this Israeli finance minister, the most right-wing extremist ultra-nationalist finance minister in history, has been withholding those funds from the Palestinian Authority, not transferring them. And the Palestinian Authority is forced to operate really on 1/3 of its budget, probably even less because of the downturn due to the war. And as the Prime Minister said, a year of salaries unpaid, and that I think strikes home, and that's very resonant at a time when the U.S. government is shut down. Israel also controls all the borders, the Palestinian population registry, the movement of their leaders, and as the Prime Minister alluded to, also not only do they not have their own currency, and they're required by treaty to use the Israeli currency. There's this extraordinary situation where the Israeli central bank and Israeli banks won't even accept back billions of dollars of Israeli currency from Palestinian banks to digitize it so that they can put it to use, which effectively means that the Palestinian Authority, as poor as it is effectively loaning the government of Israel billions of dollars. So they're just in this incredibly difficult situation with very little leverage, and that's why I
asked him if it was a recipe for failure, and he sounded semi-optimistic. I guess you have to be.
Look, I mean, yeah, I mean, if you lose hope, you just go home, and we end up in a world of hurt. But I think you also asked him about whether or not the recognition by, about 10 European countries and Canada and Australia was just symbolic, or does it mean something tangible? And I think it's somewhere in between. Really, it is symbolic. But it also sends a message, right? That and those recognitions occurred while the war was still raging in Gaza. And the message was that it's not just enough for the war to end, that these countries want to see the world moving towards a situation where we end this kind of intolerable situation, which we've had for decades now, more than half a century, of one group of people ruling over another. And so I think sending that message is important and does provide hope and does enable, those Palestinian, as he referred to, those Palestinian policemen, the Palestinian teachers to go to work, even when they are, they've been missing, a year of salary equivalent out of the last year and 3 years, because they're just paying them, a quarter of their salary this month or half that month.
Ambassador, your takeaways?
Well, like you and like Hady, I'm struck by, of course, the challenges that the Prime Minister, the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian people face. His enumeration of everything they're trying to do with very little resources and all the restrictions on movement, 1,000 checkpoints and things. Of course, that struck me. It reminded us of just how hard this is. But I was thinking through his comments on the international stabilization forces proposed for Gaza, as well as for governance in Gaza, and I don't feel as though we yet have a good idea of what governance in Gaza is going to look like. Given the, as you yourself pointed out, Vivian, the sort of, shall we say, lack of enthusiasm that much of the Palestinian public has for the Palestinian Authority, for the reasons we mentioned, given Israel's opposition to the Palestinian Authority, and given the power that Hamas still has. When I read about the speculations about post-war governance in Gaza, I'm sort of scared by the example of Lebanon. Of course, I was, as Suzanne mentioned at the beginning, I was U.S. ambassador in Lebanon, and you had a situation in Lebanon. It's changing now. We can talk about that if we widen our aperture a bit. But we had a situation in Lebanon for years where Hezbollah basically exercised control over major decisions such as war and peace, exercised major political power through intimidation, assassinations, etc., without any political responsibility. And I fear that we could be very easily moving that direction in Gaza, where you have some kind of authority that's not Hamas, but that Hamas still exercises power through intimidation, other things on that authority. So you have power being exercised without responsibility.
I mean, I wanted to ask the Prime Minister, unfortunately, we had so much to cover, but really, you look at the security situation in Gaza right now, hours after a ceasefire is announced and Hamas is shooting its rivals in the streets. It seems that there's an extraordinary gap between this notion of rebuilding Gaza and the ceasefire, everything that comes in the middle, this notion of getting an international security force and all that, it's still in discussion phase. All the while, people have no food, people have no place to live. And there's deep, deep anger and grievances among the population there. How then do you go in there? And you've worked in these situations around the world. How do you then go into a post-war situation where the place is literally in ruins? People are angry, people are frustrated, people are hungry. And you say, okay, we're going to have peace now. Everybody kind of calm down. And oh, by the way, the Palestinian Authority is going to lead you.
Well, and I think it's more complicated than other situations that we've seen because of the Israeli security concerns about what goes into Gaza. So doing reconstruction is going to be a much harder task than simply finding the money. You're going to have to figure out ways that the Israelis feel comfortable enough with the importation of building materials that they don't feel that there's going to be an entirely new tunnel infrastructure rebuilt under Gaza. Yeah. It's an incredibly complicated task, even if you take the experience of rebuilding post-conflict places elsewhere.
Right. I mean, Hady, one of the things that he obviously talked about, and I know something you're very interested in, is this concept of reforms of the Palestinian Authority, something that, deeply frustrates Washington for sure, regardless of the administration. Do you feel that the Palestinian Authority understands that if it is going to be a real player in the future of Gaza, but also even the West Bank at this point, that it needs to kind of rein in some of the issues that have plagued it for so long?
Yeah, so thanks for raising that question. And it's, I think the way I think about it and having engaged with them over the years is, we in the United States, what is our most fundamental vehicle for driving reform as citizens? It's elections, right? And so the challenge in Palestinian society is that, while they've had local elections, they really haven't had national elections in many years. President Abbas has overstayed his mandate on the one hand. On the other hand, he really pushed hard to have elections in 2021, and essentially they didn't get an affirmative answer from Israel that would allow them to move forward with those elections. But I agree that that reform is important, and the best way to move forward with reform is to have elections. Now, when it comes to issues, as the Prime Minister referenced, it's very interesting. They set up a compact, for over $1 billion of funding from the Europeans to reform across a range of a half dozen areas in terms of reforming the health sector, reducing government expenditures, some education reform, e-payments, a citizen complaint mechanism, all these things. And so the European governments have really, alongside the World Bank, have been working closely with them on reform. And then there's this issue, right, of the Palestinian prisoner payment system moving ahead that President Abbas kind of decided to reform. We've heard Israeli allegations that the reform isn't real. The Palestinians say, the Europeans say actually, that they've hired an independent audit firm to assess that. And so we'll see in the weeks ahead what the truth of that matter is.
I do want to allow some of our audience to ask you all some smart questions, but before that, Ambassador, you mentioned Lebanon. I really would like to take the 30,000-foot view from a regional perspective in terms of how things have changed in the last 2 years. Obviously, Hezbollah's capabilities have been diminished somewhat. Syria has a new president. Assad is gone. Iran's capabilities have, for now at least, been somewhat diminished. How does this play a role in what's happening in the West Bank, in Gaza, and of course in Israel?
Well, I think that as your question indicated, this is the most dramatic change we've seen in the broader region since, I would say, the Iranian Revolution, 1979. The sorts of changes we've seen, the different dynamics over the past couple of years. The region hasn't seen anything like this for decades. I would put the changes now as being ahead of the 2011 Arab uprisings, or so-called Arab Spring, with basically the weakening of Iran and its proxy network, and the collapse of the Assad regime. But there's the change in the Israeli sort of tactic strategy after October 7th, where the Israelis are no longer, the Israeli government is no longer willing to rely on sort of the type of mutual assured destruction deterrence that they felt that they had with Hezbollah over the years before October 7th, where the Israelis are going to continue to strike where they believe, or where they argue that there is an active threat against them. And we see this in Lebanon. I mean, the changes in Lebanon have been, as I say, as someone who lived in Lebanon for 4 years, I find them almost unbelievable when I look back at the time I was there, where you have a president and prime minister who are hinting at talking directly with the Israelis, for example, where you have the Israeli government, the Lebanese government that's exercised control over the Lebanese ports and airports, rather than leaving that to Hezbollah. Very dramatic changes.
Mhm.
But they are not sufficient from the Israeli security perspective, as we've seen with the ongoing Israeli strikes. And I think that what we're seeing in Gaza is very similar to what we've been seeing in Lebanon since the so-called ceasefire with Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel from November of last year, which is that the Israelis are going to continue to strike when they believe that they can remove a potential threat to them, that they're going to be more and more aggressive. And so how does a Palestinian entity, how does the Lebanese government, how does the Syrian government continue to try to develop policies that we Americans would see as inherently good for stability in the region, as inherently good for those countries, when they also have to be pushing back against the Israelis? Lebanon, for example, there was an Israeli ground incursion today in Lebanon. The Israelis have held 5 strategic positions, they would say, in southern Lebanon since that ceasefire agreement, but ground incursions are less frequent. And there was a ground incursion where allegedly a municipal worker was killed. And so that puts the president of Lebanon, who has gone out to say, okay, maybe we should drop this ridiculous taboo of not being able to talk to our enemies. Maybe we should talk to the Israelis directly. It puts him in a difficult position in how he tries to gain political support, particularly when it comes to Hezbollah's weapons, since Hezbollah will use the Israeli incursions, Israeli airstrikes, and Israeli occupation of those 5 strategic points as justification for maintaining the arms, despite a Lebanese government decision that Lebanon should have Lebanese armed forces should have a monopoly of arms in the entire country.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, your question got me deeply thinking about, how this kind of moves forward, whether or not Israel is able to leverage on some of the ceasefire talk to be able to engage more broadly in the region, now that some of those elements have been weakened. But
I don't know, because the logic of the Abraham Accords, which was, arguably President Trump's most important foreign policy success in his first term. The logic of those Abraham Accords was, okay, Abu Dhabi, we the Emiratis are looking across the Gulf at a unpredictable and dangerous neighbor, Iran, with its proxy networks that can threaten us. Its missile program can threaten us. We need to find a way to work with the Israelis to balance the Iranian hegemony. Well, now, as Iran is severely weakened, not out of the game by any means, but severely weakened, and Israel has shown that it's willing to attack even Doha if it sees a need to. It changes the logic where you could have Gulf partners that might have desired to have more of a partnership with the Israelis to balance the Iranians, now saying, but wait a minute, maybe the risk to stability in the region isn't really Iran today, but it's Israel. And it makes the logic of the Abraham Accords, it turns it upside down.
Hady, I want to ask you in particular, my next question, had we had more time for the Prime Minister, would have been on elections, in the Palestinian elections. President Mahmoud Abbas has been there for 15 years or so. And by the way, this is one of the, Seth Moshman also has this question too. He's been there for 15 years with no prospects of him, change. What dynamic needs to happen for the Palestinians to play a constructive role in anticipating a process for achieving statehood and having fair elections? We don't even know a timeline at this point.
Well, so actually it's been 20 years, more than 20 years, since the last Palestinian, since he was elected. And
2006, right?
Yeah, time. Yeah. So look, I think President Abbas was asked by the Europeans who recognized, Palestinian statehood, to commit to a timeline for elections. And again, President Abbas they had said to us, the United States, and they had intended to hold elections in 2021. part of those elections, as by the Oslo Accords, requires Israel to allow Palestinians in East Jerusalem to vote. Israel would not give them an affirmative signal on that. So there's a couple of things I'd like to see. So first is, I think, look, it's going to be a challenge, I think, to hold elections in the Gaza Strip in the immediate term. But in the first instance, what I'd like to see is, there are local Palestinian elections for city councils actually set for April of this coming year. And the Palestinians have a highly professionalized elections commission. And so I think one thing we can watch for is whether those elections go forward in April. Does that give the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip at least agency to hold those local elections? And if that goes off successfully, we can move towards a place where maybe in the years ahead there can be Palestinian elections. And there's a whole kind of seminar we could have on that. And there's some challenges. But I think it is entirely possible. And I think it's in the interests of the Palestinian people and, frankly, the Palestinian leadership to have elections go forward. What's not clear to me is if it's in the interests of the Israeli government to have elections go forward. And because if elections go forward, as the president alluded to, it kind of reduces the division of the West Bank and Gaza, shows the Palestinians as a responsible authority, gives them more legitimacy in front of their own people and the international community. And so I think what we're going to need to see is really if we can see a demonstration on the Palestinian side for again these local elections, and that they want to go forward with national elections, that we really move in that direction. Last thing I'll say is that's obviously, if you want to have national elections, that's going to require security and stability in the Gaza Strip. And as Ambassador Feltman alluded to, and you have, and the Prime Minister, we're in an incredibly precarious situation in the Gaza Strip right now. And every day that goes by in Gaza, I'm just holding my breath because what the world has learned in Iraq, and I worked in Bosnia after the war there, is that the more time that goes by before a stable peace comes into play, the more that can go wrong, and we could be back in a kind of a negative spiral again. And so I really hope that international security stabilization force for the Gaza Strip can move in quickly, can stabilize the situation for the population, and then so that Palestinian peoples can be in Gaza can begin reconstructing their lives, so that we can get to a place that we all want to see, right? Where that the Palestinian people can have elections, and we can move towards a world where we can get to an outcome that is beneficial to all.
Carl Polzer poses an interesting question, which I'll put to the two of you, which is it time to start considering a three-state solution as Gaza and the West Bank separately? And would that potentially speed up the prospects for Palestinian statehood? Ambassador, yeah.
I will defer to Hady, but because he's had more recent engagement with the Palestinians, but I think that the Palestinian reaction would be, yet again, we aren't at the table as something is being decided about our fate, because the Palestinians themselves will not want to be divided like that on the 22% of, quote, historic Palestine that comprises the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So I think that we make it more difficult to get Palestinian agency and Palestinian buy-in if we start talking about a three-state solution, even if geographically that looks logical for those of us just looking at maps.
Look, it's an interesting question, and in many ways we have been living in the three-state or three-entity solution for the last 18 years. Where Hamas has controlled Gaza, the Palestinian Authority has, I want to say, they haven't really controlled the West Bank. They have some modicum of control over, 20% of the West Bank, and we have, Israel basically controlling, all of Israel and 80% of the West Bank from a security perspective. So I would say we've been living in not the three-state but the three-entity solution, where Israel has security supremacy overall, and the Palestinians have a little bit of agency within these small territories. Look, I think the world has come to a place, and these European and Canadian and Australian recognitions of a Palestinian state are one that the world is not willing to tolerate any longer this system where one group of people is kind of ruling over another. And we need to find a safe and secure way that Israelis and Palestinians can enjoy the same rights, the same freedoms, the same security, the same prosperity. And I think, the truth is there are some elements in the Trump plan that get us moving in that direction, but we've got to move swiftly. We've got to get the stabilization force in there, and then we've got to move from there, right, to a place where we can have a Palestinian governance in Gaza that then leads us to elections, that leads us to ideally, right, in an ideal world, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza living side by side in peace and security with Israel. I think that's what the world wants. That's what the Palestinian people want. That's what the Arab world wants. And I think Israel is just not there at the moment, embracing that vision. Although I will say, on the eve of October 7th, I sat in the U.S. chair at the United Nations, listening to a year prior to that, the then Israeli Prime Minister saying that he embraced a two-state solution. So I'm talking a year before October 7th. I'm sorry. So there is a path forward, but the critical first step is that security force in Gaza, followed by Palestinian governance for Gaza, followed by Palestinian elections, where the Palestinian people can express their views. And again, there's a whole seminar we can have on how that can be done, because it's a little complicated. But I think that's the world we all want, that so many of us want to see.
I would add, Hady, I think that the essential element here is making sure that President Trump stays engaged, because none of the parties, whether we're talking about Hamas or we're talking about even the Israeli far right or Israeli public traumatized by October 7th, no one wants to annoy, irritate, shall I say, piss off President Trump. And that his attention is, I think, what is essential to moving to the steps that you've described, to making sure. And I would hope that the fact that there's an infrastructure being set up already, such as the Civilian Military Coordination Committee, that you have Lieutenant General Patrick Frank on the ground in Kiryat Gat, that you have other countries involved. I would hope that there's a certain forward momentum that's being built in that keeps things moving. But there will be problems. There will be problems. And I think President Trump's attention is essential to being able to transcend the downs to make sure we keep moving in the direction you described.
Absolutely right. President Trump has the power, and he's expressed the will. He said he wanted the war to end. The war has ended. He seems to want a Nobel Peace Prize and to bring into the world, an end to this conflict. And if he stays focused, he has the ability to compel the parties to do the right thing. And it's just a question of whether he's going to do that or get led down a track, either by Hamas on the one hand or Netanyahu on the other, to conflict.
We have less than a minute and a half left. Just closing thoughts from the two of you about what comes next. Maybe Ambassador, we'll start with you.
I think that we need that it's not only, I'm glad we focused on Gaza, but we also need to be looking at the entire region, how we make sure. I'm worried about the situation in Syria, that to make sure the interim government is able to stabilize the security situation, how the Lebanese government can move forward with its plan to have a monopoly on arms, to make sure that this end of war in Gaza also means a promotion of peace and stability throughout the whole region.
And thanks, Vivian. And then I guess the last thing I'd say, in a sense, what I said earlier were my kind of sum up remarks. But what I'd also add, what I'd like to add to that, is that it's important for us to not lose sight of the fact that the last 2 years in the West Bank have been the most painful years for Palestinians on record, with more than 1,000 Palestinians killed in the West Bank in violent ways since October 7th, 10 times higher than the typical rate, dozens of Israelis killed as well, Israeli settler extremist violence off the charts against Palestinians, GDP plummeting, and a rapid expansion of Israeli settlement growth in the West Bank and Israeli outposts. So there are challenges all around, but the bottom line is that President Trump, if he stays tenacious and he said he's going to call the shots and he says he wants to bring about peace, he has the tools to do so if he stays in that kind of tenacious footing.
Really interesting discussion on an extraordinarily challenging issue. I want to thank both Ambassador Feltman and Hady, but also obviously Prime Minister Mustafa and Suzanne at Brookings, everyone at Brookings for hosting this discussion. Thank you all so much. We're going to turn off our cameras now. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.